There's a number in South African wine that appears to change everything. 35. 35 years in the ground and a vine stops behaving like any other vine. Today, we sit down with one of only 250 masters of wine in the entire world to find out why exactly this number is so special. Welcome back to the Vineymark podcast. I'm sitting down with Cathy van Zyl, Master of Wine and Director of the Old Vine Project, for a conversation that took me somewhere I really didn't expect. We started with how a teenager sneaking wine past her rum and coke drinking friends ended up becoming one of the most respected voices in South African wine. And from there, we get into the real question. What actually makes a vine old, and why does 35 years matter so much? Stick around because the science and the soil behind this answer genuinely surprised me.
You're a master of wine. That doesn't happen overnight. You've had, 3-4 decades in wine? How long in wine? And when did those overlap?
No, it's more than that. It's...
Unless you started when you were 10.
Not quite 10, but yes, my gang of friends and I at high school, we obviously, as all teenagers do throughout the ages, and no teenager at this point in time can think that they're breaking any rules that their parents didn't break. We used to have fries at Saturdays and Sundays at the house of the parents that were out for the day.
Of course.
And while my friends were drinking rum and coke, Captain Morgan and Coke, I would sneak into the bottle store up the road and buy myself either a bottle of Baron or Edelroot. And so this was 15, 16, 17. I was already drinking wine then.
Yes.
While my friends were more into the spirits and the beers. And I think it was largely because of my grandfather, who used to take us to Old Ed's in Johannesburg for Christmas every year. And when we stopped going to Old Ed's, I think they privatized and they started letting people other than Old Edwardians become members of the club. We used to do Christmas at home, and my grandfather and I used to always select the wines for the Christmas table. So that's potentially where that came from. But Barossa owes its market share in the late 1980s to Philip and myself and our consumption of Barossa. And then Philip and I were already married, so this would have been in 1989 or 1990 when I'd cycled the Argus cycle tour with a hockey friend of mine. And I was very fit at that point in time. I was playing a great deal of outdoor hockey and indoor hockey. But we went to cycle the Argus and I absolutely loved it. And I said to her, we're going to do another one. And she said, I've been there, done the T-shirt, done that. And so I asked Philip if he would go for me. And he said, yep, but only if you go on a wine course with me. So off we went to the Cape Wine Academy and we started doing that little entry.
So he dragged you in?
Well,
so you drank the wine, but he...
And he also drank the wine, but he was the one who decided, let's get intellectual about this. And we went on a little wine course, but when you do so well on your little wine course and then you try a certificate and they still give you a good mark and you think, I can do this wine, it's easy, and you land up doing diploma. And eventually Philip said to me one day, when we were still living in Johannesburg, it was in the end of 1994, shouldn't we go and live in the Cape to be closer to the vines? And at that stage he was freelancing, I was freelancing, so I said, yes, of course.
Yeah.
And he said, well, what are we going to do? And I said, you know what, John and Erica are getting old, let's take over Platter.
No, you did not.
So
that's amazing.
Lovely old Jewish saying, from my lips, or from your lips to God's ears. And it didn't quite unfold like that. It had a longer path for me, a shorter path for Philip. Yeah. But that's how we got into wine. And then, Richard Kelly, Master of Wine, and Tim James, before he resigned as a member of the Institute of Cape Wine Masters, and because he'd obviously passed his Cape Wine Masters, they always used to argue. We belonged to a wine tasting club, and one lazy Sunday afternoon after a long wine tasting club, I heard them arguing and saying, well, Cathy could. Yeah, well, maybe Cathy could. Well, yes, no, Cathy could. So I said, what could Cathy do? And they said, pass the Master of Wine. So I said, yeah, why not? Let's give it a go. Yeah. And that's what happened.
Wow. How did you move from, because obviously you have been an independent consultant for many, many years. When did you start working with the Old Vine Project specifically?
When I started my wine journey, I was a freelance writer. I specialised in writing for the advertising/marketing industry, as well as for the IT industry.
Okay.
Because I had been thrown into editing publications many, many moons ago, like in 1984, 1985, called Marketing Mix. So I kind of stayed in that track, but obviously I went and did the Master of Wine. We moved to the Cape to be closer to the source of this liquid. I was very, very interested in the wine industry. And at the stage when I applied to do the Master of Wine, the Master of Wine's requirements for applying were not as stringent as they are now.
Okay.
Right now, we say you have to have done a WSET or equivalent. We also say that you have to have been in the trade for at least 3 years, and you have to have a member of the trade signing you off before you can even endorsing you before you can sit the entrance exam. When I applied, you didn't have to be in the trade per se, but I was at that stage already doing some lecturing and doing some writing, and wanted to do more. So I'm motivated that I wanted to become a Master of Wine in order to spread the word about wine and global wine in South Africa. And they fell for that hook, line and sinker.
There we go.
And so we did always have to have this thing that you then had to earn most of your income from your wine activities.
That's interesting.
And I was lucky enough that I could prove that I tasted for the Platters Wine Guide. I mean, the minute I got my MW, I was allowed to join the team, not before that. Philip's rule, not mine, but it was a good rule. And then I also started doing lecturing for the Cape Wine Academy, and I started doing more wine writing abroad and judging abroad. So I was able to prove that I was very active in the wine industry.
Okay.
But I ran my freelance writing and PR consultancy alongside that. And that actually saved me during COVID, because everything wine related stopped, but my marketing business kept on going. And then after COVID, I decided, no, I'm handing that over to my business partner, and I'm going to be full-time in wine. I was already mostly full-time in wine because I just used to do wine things during the day or during the night, and then do a little bit of the marketing side. Yeah. It was winding down anyway. It was dying a natural death. And then one of my very first, well, not my very first, but it was 2 years ago that Barossa asked me to be a director of the Old Vine Project. So I haven't been involved for that long, but it's, I think, quite useful that I do come from a quote-unquote marketing background or semi-marketing background, because I work very closely with Nadia Heffer, who's another director, just been made a director of the Old Vine Project, in doing a lot of the member engagement things, and doing helping her do the marketing side of it. And we've kind of developed a more marketing, consumer and trade-focused strategy going forward, whereas for the last few years, Russ and her have been very focused on members. So they've kind of a natural progression. Once they formalised the Old Vine Project in 2016, they wanted to focus on giving value to the members, and that's where Russ's strength lies in speaking to members about their vineyards, how to plant to grow old, how to prune to grow old, etc. Then when they brought me in, I started giving members now feedback on their wines, natural progression from vineyards to wines. And now that we've been doing that for a couple of years, we want to start speaking more directly to consumers and more directly to members of the trade, hence our relationship with Vinimark.
So being a consultant or freelancer with the Old Vine Project is very different to being a director of the Old Vine Project. I mean, you really are, you've fully committed to the project.
Absolutely, yeah.
What was it? Because I imagine someone like yourself can choose whatever project you want to be involved with. You work around the world in wine. So what was it that gripped your imagination or your heart about the Old Vine Project in South Africa?
I am very sentimental. I'm a very sentimental person. So looking at old vineyards is, for me, gives me a link to the, it seems to me that there's a link to the land and a link to heritage, a link to legacy, but also an optimism for the future. So there was, all of that is just embodied in our symbol of that lovely old vine. So I wanted to do that. I'm quite selective in terms of the projects that I do, and that I like to be involved in giving back, which is why I do a lot of lecturing and education, and why so much of the time that I spend is involved, whether it's with people who are actively learning or people who are not actively learning. I just like talking about wine and teaching people a little bit about wine. And I also bought into the Old Vines ethos of, so our mission is the preservation of old vineyards for the benefit of generations still to come. And that means that we have to be active in 2 points when it comes to the vineyards. The first is that we have to keep old vineyards in the ground, or encourage people to keep old vineyards in the ground. And the second is that we have to, when we're planting new vineyards, encourage people to plant to grow old. And so our initiatives, Old Vines initiatives, have been largely aimed at that. And it hinges on financial stability, environmental stability, and social sustainability. And so if you think of keeping old vines in the ground, Barossa and Nadia started together with Felco this pruning school, and any old vine member who has got pruning staff can send his pruning team to this pruning school, which lasts over, I think, 4 days or 2 days. I'm not 100% sure, not my side of the business. And their vineyard workers get taught how to prune to go old. Because, as you know from Simonetti and Search and speaking to lots of other people in the vineyards, that what you want to do is minimize pruning scars and pruning wounds, because that does take a toll on the vineyard's life. So that's one example of helping people keep vines in the ground. The other example of helping keep vines in the ground is what I think is one of the most monumental flash of light moments that the Old Vine Project ever had, and that was instigating the Heritage Vineyard seal, the Certified Heritage Vineyard seal. And that we can only do because SAWIS has records dating back to the 1900s. So SAWIS is kind of the secret weapon of the Old Vine Project's arsenal. And the reason why I think that is such a no-brainer is because it enabled Dr. Jonathan Steyn and the UCT's Graduate School of Business, in conjunction also, I think, with WineTech, to do that research into exactly what does the words old vines mean when a consumer comes across them on a label.
Well, that's what I mean. I wanted to, just to cut you off there, I wanted to ask that question exactly that, because when it comes to people, it's impossible to get anyone to admit when they're old. Whereas it feels like the Old Vine Project, it is premised on the fact that we can at some point call a vine old.
Correct.
Which is 35 years.
Yes.
So why did you guys reach that age? How did you come to that number?
The people like Barossa, the viticulturists, the people who make wine, and the academics who work with vineyards, worldwide they do have very much common ground. They've noticed that at some stage in its life, a vine starts to kind of more limit its balance or to control its balance on its own. The reserves that it can absorb from the earth, the temperature and the climate, the rainfall, the winds around it, so your vintage conditions, and then also the reserves that it might have built up over years in the hardwood, the trunk. So at some stage in its point in life, an old vine starts reflecting the soils in which it's planted, the vintage conditions it's endured, and the current climatic conditions as well that are happening around. And it uses that to restrict its vigour. So that can manifest in the number of bunches it bears, or the size of the bunches, and the size of the grapes, even down to the size of the grapes. And they agree that at some stage, older vines tend to do this better than younger vines. Now you'll notice I've used the word do it better or do it more efficiently. It just seems to be a more natural flow for older vines to do it. Younger vines, I'm not going to say that they can't do it, but they might not just do it as well. just to consider, take a step back to what you've learned about the optimal conditions for vine growth around the world. So you need, during the growing and ripening period, between 25 and about 32 degrees Celsius in terms of temperature. When it's too cold, you don't have as much growth as you necessarily should get. And also if it's too hot, or there's too much wind, the vine does have mechanisms for closing down photosynthesis, and you don't get optimum quality grapes from that vine. Also, in terms of rainfall, precipitation, access to water, irrigation, call it what you want, a vine needs plus minus about 500 millimeters of water a year. Can be less, can be more, depending on the variety, what rootstock it's on, but that's an average. And then also you need sufficient cold units in order for that vine to go into dormancy, to form hardwood, and to store the nutrients that it needs within the stem and its branches. Now, if you think about all those things that I've told you, where in South Africa do you get those kind of optimum conditions? Are we always exactly between that
certainly not.
That degrees Celsius? Do we get as much rainfall? Maybe in some regions, maybe not in others. But South Africa's climatic conditions are actually quite harsh. So Barossa has always said that if a vine can survive and thrive in our heat, in our wind, and in our semi-arid conditions, and it can reach 35, then she believes that that vine deserves to be called old. And she has also anecdotally noted that a vineyard around about that age does seem to achieve this natural balance. And what you need about this natural balance, it just means that the benefit for winemakers is that they get fruit into the cellar where they can treat it with the minimum of intervention. So that's what you're looking for an old vine. I think there's another factor that you have to think about when it comes to South Africa and why 35 years is not a bad estimate. And that's because of our soils, our ancient soils. The key point to remember when you're talking about South African soils is that they are very, very, very old. The base rocks, which have eroded over millennia to form the sands and the soils in which we plant our vineyards today, are over 1,000 million years old. So now think about this for a second and compare this to Europe. What this means is that we've had close to 1,000 million years old of erosion. That means extreme heat, flooding, rivers, etc. Also, we have the Cape Floral Kingdom, which is called fynbos, which is really small plants, small leaves, not as much of the forests that they have in Europe. So as a result of all of this floods that we've been exposed to, the fact that we have a very low organic origin, matter of origin compared to the high forests that they have in Europe, our soils have very low organic material in them. So there's not that much nutrient in it. So you've got 0.2% of organic matter in South Africa's soil. That's our baseline of our agricultural soils in the Cape. And you can compare this to what they've got in Europe. There are patches of Europe where they get down to about 0.5, 0.7, but they are considerably higher. The organic matter ranges between 2.5 to about 4.2% in Europe, roughly speaking. The other thing to remember, and linked to our organic soils, is the fact that our soils are very acidic. And this is because they lack the basic cations like calcium and magnesium. The other factor is that we have our winter rainfall that falls predominantly in the winter, so it's in one time of the year, and that means that all the nutrients and all the other elements of the soil are leached out from the soil during one period. And it's quite a hectic period when you have all the rain coming at one time. In Europe, they've got more even rainfall patterns throughout the year, so they don't have as much of a leaching effect. And then also the base rock, on which is much younger in Europe, about 500 million years old compared to our 1,000 million years old. And the base rock is also more of a calcium limestone content. So that's automatically raises the acidity and lowers the pH. Now, if you take all of those factors, our acidic soil, our low organic matter in the soil, our harsh climatic conditions, you have to agree that maybe South Africa is an extreme climate and an extreme place to grow vines. Interestingly, there's one other old vine association, and that's the one based in Barossa. And as you know, they have 4 different categories. They call old vines over 35 years. They've got vines over 75 years, which they call survivor vines, largely because they survived the old pull-out schemes of the 1980s. Then they've got the centenaries. Those are the guys that have been in the ground for over 100 years. And then they've got what they call ancestral vines, which are over 125, I think. Donna, is that right?
Yes.
Yes. So they've got this old vine, 35 years. But there's another factor, and it's also linked back to soil, that quite a number of the other areas around the world where you find old vines, like those desolate places in Spain, but particularly in Barossa, is because Barossa is on very, very sandy soil and it was very isolated. And so Barossa has never had phylloxera. So it didn't have to go through all the vine pull-out schemes during the stage when phylloxera was raging through South Africa and then raging through other areas in Australia and in New Zealand. That's why they've got these vines that are now 175, some of them are 107. The oldest vine in Barossa is a Grenache vineyard, and it's 175 years old.
Fascinating.
So minus 2025 minus 175, and that's when, it would have been planted before that.
Yes, but so can we talk about Barossa for a little while?
Yes, sure.
Because as a project, it fascinates me that they have gone very distinct on their categories. And we talked earlier about how the 35-year bracket, it is agreed upon by these institutions around the world, in Chile, in Australia, in Lodi, in South Africa. We can all agree on 35, but it feels like Australia has really built in extra mechanisms or layers. Do you think there is merit to this? Is there, again, a clear physiological change? We talked about how at 35 years of age, there's this shift, and we can all agree that the vines begin to behave in a slightly different way. Do we see the same sorts of changes at 70 or 75 years, at 100, at 125 years? Okay,
so 2 things. Firstly, I think that 35 years is important because in another one of Rosa's milestones, supported by other people from the industry, and they made the application to the OIV to have 35 years declared the minimum age at which you can declare your vines as old vines. And if we want to come back to this, we can talk about it, but this is largely because in many of the European countries, although they have designations for old vines, such as Alter Reben in Germany and Vigour in France, they don't have legislation or stipulation as to when you can call your vines old. And the less scrupulous people selling wine knew that it could be, and with all the work that Barossa and the Old Vine projects are doing around the world, you could just claim old vine status, but if you don't have to actually formally comply with anything, then you can take advantage of the work that other people are doing when you're putting 20-year-old vines into your bottle, say, for example. So the OIV adopting 35 years as the minimum was a huge milestone in protecting this category of old vines. I personally believe. I think it was great.
But that initiative to create a global standard was driven by South Africa's Old Vine project.
Correct. Yes, it was. It's a huge milestone, and I think it's done to acknowledge that. I think Barossa fought the fight on 2 fronts. One, to acknowledge that South Africa's vines have to fight that much harder than quite enough vines in a number of other places. I mean, maybe not the hardest. There are more extreme vine growing places, but they might be mitigated by having extra water, but it might be incredibly hot or it might be cold, but they've got something else that benefits them. And the other thing is to protect the work that we are doing to protect the old vines the words old vine, so that it supports our financial sustainability initiatives, because we want consumers to recognize that they need to pay more for old vine wines, and thereby we'll be able to convince farmers to keep old vines in the ground. So maybe they were already listening to Barossa and her articles and her interviews on an old vine is around 35 years of age, because they chose that to be one of their designations, 35 years. In fact, I couldn't see anything on the website, but they might well have just reacted to the OIV's request, which would have been really nice. But then, if you think about it, the next category, the survivor category, is named for a hallmark in history. So it is, in a way, a nod to the legacy and the history of the Barossas. And then the centenarians, that is chosen because of a nice round number, potentially. 100 years in the ground. It's a lovely way to measure something. I mean, I had to wait a year before joining the Institute of Masters of Wine, because I got feedback on my dissertation at that stage, too late to make the final tweaks they wanted to graduate in the November. So I had to do that and graduate in the following November in 2005. But I'm number 250 MW in the world. It rolls so much nicer off the tongue than 249th, doesn't it? So there you go. We've got a reason, a 100-year-old. And then the other ones, the antiquarians, that also, I think that does both. It acknowledges the vines that were planted and that were then not pulled out, or didn't fall prey to any of the phylloxera, because when they say Barossa, there might have been patches where Barossa had phylloxera, or some people might have panicked, and some growers might have panicked and pulled out their vines and put them on other rootstock, and they didn't need to because of the conditions in the Barossa. Personally, I think they chose the names very carefully, with a nod to both history and legacy, and to people's sentiments around that. They chose it, I think, from a marketing point of view, because it's nice and easy. These things slot into nice, clean things that are easy to explain, that consumers can understand. And I asked Rosa about are there distinct physiological changes? And she said, no research has been done. It's an area in which has only recently become a hot topic around the world. So the guys are starting to redo the research. But she says, yes, there are certain physiological changes, but that's about as far as we got. And I'm not a vigneron, so I can't talk to you about that.
But I think you touched on a really interesting point. You said the Old Vine Project now in South Africa is really ramping up its efforts to speak directly to the consumer, and that's really a lot of the work you're doing. I think the Barossa Charter shows that same sensibility. Like you said, they've chosen ages perhaps based on points in history. A centenarian, I think that's romantic on a whole bunch of different levels, whether it's a building or a cricket score or a vine. So that's very easy to get into the mind of the consumer. And I would assume the ancestor vine's 125 years and older. That's closer to when phylloxera was in Australia, which was 1877 onwards.
Onwards, yeah.
So all of those milestones make sense in the mind of the consumer. And we talked about the Vignard de Flores de Carignan in Chile. So they have their milestone at 60 years of age, and it's only for Carignan, and it's only from Maule. Again, that's a very distinct idea that's easy to put in the mind of the consumer. Do you think that the Old Vine Project could learn from some of these examples in how they connect with the consumer? Because right now, it seems quite broad in South Africa. We've been doing it for a long time, but we've kept the scope of the marketing very broad. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
So if we take a step back, the majority of the old vines that we have at this point in time are quite expensive when you have to dig your hand in your pocket and shell your money out over the counter. And they've also been made from a segment of our producers that more readily engaged with this more informed consumer, or a consumer who's hungry for knowledge. So they might not necessarily be in the wine industry, they might not necessarily be interested in studying about wine, etc., but they are probably people who eat out a lot and who are always looking for interesting cultural experiences within wine and food culture. But remember that we want to address financial stability and social stability and environmental stability. but I think that their focus on speaking to growers and interacting with growers to encourage them to keep the vines in the ground could only have been achieved by Rosa and Nadia getting in the car and going to visit growers on a weekly basis and speak to them about their vineyards. And the work that they did, matching growers up or people who had pockets of old vines with winemakers who were able to take those grapes and turn them into a product that could command this roughly R2 more per year that the vine has been in the ground. So that it adds up to about R203 more for an old vine because it would have been in the ground for 35 years. And yes, so they were speaking to a certain market. I think we've come to some kind of we've spoken about it, and it is one of my initiatives, passions, something that I would love to achieve while I'm working for the Old Vine Project, is to take old vine to a broader target market. And we do have, I think, there are places where we do have these old vines, quite a lot of old vines. I mean, Paarl, for example, Paarl, Stellenbosch, and the Swartland all have over 1,000 hectares of old vines. So you've also got to remember that in terms of the way they're farmed, the way the wines are made, not all old vines can be Scoofbergs, to put it into mind. But there are old vines that will deliver a little bit extra, a little bit distinction, that potentially can be shown to the consumers and can reach a broader consumer market. And I'm thinking of, for example, the hills, the mountains around Groenberg, around Wellington. There's a lot of old vine Chenin there that goes to the cooperative, and potentially they will be able to produce a wine that reaches, where your quantities aren't limited. There's only so much you can make out of Scoofberg. But maybe if you can harness a lot of these old vine blocks growing on the Groenlandberg, you could get more than 1,000 cases of wine. You could get 10,000 cases or 25,000 cases, and that means you could take it in.
So I guess in that sense, it feels like the Old Vine Project is a little microcosm of South African wine at large, in that many of our best wines, we just don't produce enough of them to make an impact, to be memorable in the international market.
The wines of relevance, that kind of little microcosm goes across not only our old vines, but also our top-notch, high-quality wines that can command prices the same as Bordeaux and Premier Cru, Burgundies or Village Burgundies.
But in that sense, sorry, just on that note, it feels like there's like a desperate dichotomy there, in that our best, most memorable old vine wines are in tiny quantities. And then you have these mass wines that may be from old vine vineyards, but perhaps don't have personality. I guess it puts, you think of something like Kleine Vineyard Selection, Old Vine Chenin, actually in this really positive tier that retail-wise it is less than 200 Rand a bottle, but they're making it in really large quantities.
And then there's a couple of other producers. Spear does it as well, and then a label that's put out. I can't remember now. Oh my God, the Vinyl Collection.
Oh, yes.
Yes, that is also, that is Wellington fruit, and that's only just over 120 Rand. But you don't want to start talking how much wine in South Africa retails for under 100 Rand. It's something like 92%. Wow. So there's consumers and there's consumers. So if we can first start talking to consumers at 100 Rand, 120, 150 Rand, that does give that would motivate people to keep their vines in the ground. And then we can maybe see where else we can go from there.
That number, 35, isn't just a nice round figure. It's backed by decades of soil science, climate data, and a global movement South Africa helped to start. But knowing why old vines matter is only half the story. The harder question is, why don't more farmers keep them in the ground? Now, in part 2, Cathy takes us into a vineyard in the pouring rain where that exact decision was being made in real time. You don't want to miss that.